Well, hi, everyone. We're Robin Miller and Kate Hinnant, and we are the authors of a recently published book called Making Surveys Work for Your Library. Kate and I became friends before we started working together as librarians, and I think that one of the reasons we are friends is that we have a shared passion for both taking surveys and talking about surveys, and now as librarians, writing surveys and distributing them to people who tell us the answers to our many questions.
We would always text each other examples of usually, survey questions that we thought were either bizarre or poor. And then when we were put in a position where we were actually writing our own surveys, we realized that it takes quite a bit to design a survey that's really effective for the audience that you're surveying.
But we aren't trained statisticians or social psychologists or anything like that. So we really learned this practice by doing it. So let's dive in. So today we will talk about when a survey is the best tool for the job, and strategies for planning a survey with intention and with empathy for the survey respondent. After we talk about those two issues, we'll take a break for some questions if you have any, and then we will dive into creating survey questions, and and finally testing questions and fixing the questions that don't work. And then we'll take more questions at the end of our hour together. So when you're considering conducting a survey, an essential first question is, can we answer the questions that we have with data that we already have? So an obvious example, when you're reporting, say, your annual circulation stats, you probably don't ask your patrons to estimate for you how many items they have checked out over the last year. Instead, you go to your integrated library system and you download your total circulation data. Individual reports of factual information like that are generally unreliable. And also, we have these systems that we're already utilizing to count that kind of thing. So this slide shows some examples of the data that Kate and I collect in our library at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. So we're already counting how many people attend our information literacy sessions, and we're already counting how many classes our librarians are teaching, and how many consultations we have, and how many circulation events we have with various kinds of equipment and other aspects of our collection. Since we're already counting this, we don't need to ask people to tell us that they participated in these surveys or in these activities. We have that information. But looking at this data in another way, all the library users who participated in these programs form an audience of potential survey respondents who may be willing to answer questions about their feelings and their preferences. So we'll talk more about audience in a few minutes, but when we look at data like this, what it tells us is that we have an audience, and we can go to that audience with questions about the experience that we've already counted. It's worth discussing when surveys don't work. There are a lot of cases where they don't work. And we've noticed a rising tide in the library literature of criticism that libraries overuse surveys. We don't necessarily disagree with that assertion, but we don't think it's because surveys are bad tools. We think instead that surveys are often misused for the question at hand. Sometimes surveys are just distributed to see what we can learn, sort of out of curiosity, but with only a vague intention or plan. So this approach could yield an insight or two, but it's probably not going to change the course of library operations or strategy. The problem with these questionnaires is that survey respondents can tell if the information that they are providing is going to be useful or important to the library. So once I responded to a survey about a library facility, or that's what I thought it would be about, but the library had decided to be cute in the course of asking those questions, and more than half of the questions were not about the library facility at all, but they were questions like, are you a cat person or a dog person? And which founding father are you? And things like that. And the problem with surveys like that is that they're not a good use of the respondents' time, and they're not collecting data that we can actually use to make real decisions in the library. That's just one of many examples, but I think it's worth remembering that we can go to BuzzFeed to take quizzes about our personalities, but when we take a survey for the library, we're probably doing it because we want to help the library. So sometimes surveys are also conducted to support pre-existing views. So in other words, a respondent takes some time out of their day to offer honest feedback in response to a question. And then the analysts of the survey data just select the responses that support a decision that has probably already been made. We call that cherry picking. Surveys that are mostly open-ended questions are also very common in libraries, and these surveys strongly lend themselves to cherry picking as well. So there's an advantage to the open-ended question. It offers an individual great opportunities to share their opinions in great detail, up to the number of characters or words that are allowed in the form. Unfortunately, the opposite side of the coin is that open-ended questions offer a lot of rich detail, which takes a lot of time to analyze if one is going to turn that qualitative data into a data set that can be used for decision making. So as librarians, we care about our users a lot. We want to know what they think. That's a professional ethic. But the open-ended question is just not always the best form to gather that kind of information. It generally yields a lot of anecdotes, and some of those anecdotes can inflame our passions in a positive or a negative way, but they're not necessarily going to lead us to again, some quantitative data that we can use for decision making. Because surveys are relatively easy to create, they are often used in an attempt to gather evidence that self-reported data simply can't produce. And so two really common examples are surveys that are used in an attempt to evaluate learning and surveys that are used in an attempt to demonstrate causation. Surveys absolutely can gather useful data, but self-reported data doesn't really help us to demonstrate that someone has learned or achieved the learning outcome that was set out at the beginning of a library class or training. And similarly, self-reported data can't give us the complete picture if we're trying to demonstrate causation for something like declining circulation rates or declining participation in a program or something like that. So we just want to be mindful when we're thinking about collecting survey data that we're collecting it for the reasons that it can actually help us with. But so you might be asking at this point, okay, so what good is self-reported data? And self-reported data is great. Surveys work best when they give people the opportunity to honestly account for their attitudes, feelings, and preferences. So the way this plays out in library surveys is often through questionnaires that gauge satisfaction. Data about patron satisfaction pairs very nicely with the other data that your library is already collecting, like usage statistics or gate counts or participation in programs or circulation and things like that. Having the data set of how many of whatever you've been counting paired with the opinions of your patron population in relation to whatever it is you are counting can be a really powerful way to triangulate evidence about how you're performing as a library. So another way that self-reported data is useful is engaging demand. So surveys can allow people to account for their past behavior. And so we can ask questions like, what are the primary reasons that you chose to visit this library? Or tell us about the barriers that prevent you from attending a library event or a program. So we have to remember that when we account for our past behavior, we need to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt, because people may not be inclined to admit that they don't attend library events, or that they didn't sign their child up for a summer reading program, or something like that. They might perceive the question as a condemnation of their life choices. And so the way we frame questions is really important. But that being said, Oh, but we can still give people the opportunity to tell
What?
us about their past behavior. And so we can also allow people to predict their future behavior, and this can help us to understand potential demand for services. So, anecdotally, we might know that people have expressed an interest in building a library makerspace or something like that. But a broader based survey that allows people to prioritize the different potential initiatives that the library could undertake given the available funds and space and stuff like that would tell us if we just have a small population that's interested in the makerspace versus a much larger population that's interested in an auditorium or something. Every library is different in terms of what they might be thinking about, but using surveys to gauge demand can be a really valuable planning tool. So, an important issue for us to think about when we're planning a survey is survey fatigue. Survey fatigue comes out of a psychological concept called decision fatigue. And this is very applicable to design of any kind of web based service as well as a physical in person service or a product like a survey. So, essentially, making decisions is cognitively taxing. So, as we make more decisions in a given span of time, we grow tired, we cut corners, we make errors, and our effort diminishes. And a lot of research has demonstrated that this is very true of people who take surveys. And so our first response to this should be to say, okay, we will only ask the most essential questions, and we will try to craft a survey questionnaire that is as short as possible. Decision fatigue or survey fatigue is much higher stakes in, or I guess just decision fatigue, but decision fatigue is much higher stakes in professions like healthcare or criminal justice or something like that, or even for parents of young children, where one is continuously making decisions that might relate to safety or life or death or something like that. But this kind of fatigue can crop up anywhere. And as I said, research has shown that when people are taking surveys, that kind of fatigue can affect the effort that they put into responding honestly and authentically to the survey. Decision fatigue can also affect our broader constituencies in libraries. If we were to send several different inquiries on an annual basis to all of our patrons, asking them what they prioritize or what kind of collections they like, or why they're choosing to use only ebooks and not print books or something like that, we are risking tiring out our users, confusing them too. They might think that if they just recently responded to a survey that they shouldn't respond to the next one, or that they're the same instrument and things like that. So the ultimate effect of sort of a broader based or community based decision fatigue is that our organization surveys might receive much lower response rates. In higher education, where Kate and I work, it's been pretty well documented that students are heavily over surveyed. And so what that means is that students are much less likely to participate in the surveys that their institution send to them. Even if the institution really needs that data, the students don't necessarily see it that way. They just see it as another thing to do out of many, many things to do.
And another thing about, in terms of thinking about the community, like right now in Eau Claire, we've got a survey that has come out from the school district. We've got one from the city. And then our public library is working on an expansion, so I expect we'll have one soon there. So it's not just even the surveys that you're putting out, it's also the surveys that your counterparts in the community are putting out.
Yeah, it's certainly worth noting that there are some people who will always respond to surveys because they like doing that. So Kate and I fall into that very tiny minority. But the majority of people are not likely to respond to a survey unless they have some sort of incentive. And incentives can be monetary, but in the case of a library, the incentive can also be a desire to contribute to the common good. But that incentive can be muddied or diminished if our communities are over surveyed because people just get tired of responding to questions that are basically optional. So planning a survey sounds pretty boring. Using the survey results sounds exciting, but we can't overemphasize enough the importance of the planning process. So we advocate a structured process for planning a survey. And to begin with, we want to gather a group of stakeholders together. And this doesn't necessarily mean everyone in your library. So you might work in a very small library where everyone is just a few people, or you might work in a very large library system. In either case, everyone doesn't need to be involved. but you do need to find a way to bring together some people who have knowledge of the issues and questions at hand, and who also have some knowledge of who would be surveyed, and a sense of what could be asked to understand the issue better. Our goal when we as libraries create surveys is to help ourselves to operate the library as efficiently as possible, to improve, to grow. So we're conducting surveys because we want to know about things like our users' feelings about whatever it is we're thinking about doing. The people who collaborate on a survey should be in a position to use available information to develop questions relevant to the issue. And Kate will talk more about question development in a moment. And so once you've gathered your survey development team, we advocate that you begin by cultivating empathy for the people who are going to respond to the survey. So first, thinking about what do we know about the broad issue? And then what do we need to know? And who can tell us the answers to these questions? And ultimately, how will the people who tell us the answers to the questions be aided by the data that we collect? This may be a point in the process where you gather some anecdotal information, either from your colleagues or from patrons, or certainly by conducting even focus groups or informal interviews or something like that. Those can be some preliminary inquiries that can help you get a sense of the array of possibilities for your actual survey questions. As you move through the empathy portion of the planning process, what you're doing is starting out by knowing that you have an information need, and you may believe you know what you want to know. So for example, your library director might ask you to find out why you have a growing population of inactive library users. This may seem like an opportunity to ask a lot of open-ended questions, like why haven't you used the library recently? And so if we take some time to empathize with our users, we can probably actually come up with a pretty concise list of the possible reasons that someone is choosing not to use the library. So fines and fees, for example, other library policies that people do not, or that people find alienating, hours, accessibility, or other unmet need. There's certainly an opportunity here to ask an other or an open-ended question like, what are some other reasons? But the empathy process can allow us to anticipate some responses and to craft questions that enable users to efficiently select the reasons that they are choosing not to use the library. So when you're developing a survey, you may operate with a cast a wide net philosophy. And it makes sense in one sense, because why not put it out there to the largest possible audience? But large surveys can definitely help us to generalize, which is great. So for example, in a patron satisfaction survey, especially if you are trying to monitor trends about satisfaction for a variety of services or collections or programs, looking at a large sample of your population, your user population, is a very reasonable approach. But surveys of smaller populations that are more targeted are always worth your consideration. That doesn't mean a population of 5. You could just have a focus group in that case, but a smaller subset of your population. So maybe one demographic slice. As you empathize with your users, you are very likely to find yourself zeroing in on a pretty well-defined population or set of communities. So for example, patrons who fit a particular professional profile. So like nurse practitioners, if you happen to be in a healthcare setting, or maybe the parents of children who signed up for a summer reading program, or students enrolled in a particular program, like an ESL program or an academic skills program or something like that. So surveys that are targeted to a smaller population are likely to be shorter and more focused, which is an advantage for analysis, and it's also an advantage for the people taking the survey. It takes them less time, they're more likely to complete the process. And so surveys that are targeted to smaller populations are also just lower risk. You run the risk with a large survey of fatiguing your community in general. Any survey that is poorly designed, hastily put together, untested, if it's confusing or not particularly relevant to the audience that is taking the survey, is high risk, because people are likely to discontinue participation which invalidates the results. So it makes it so you have squandered an opportunity to ask people questions and get their honest opinions. At this point, we'll pause to see if you have any questions about what we've discussed so far. And then in a few minutes, Kate is going to talk about the fun stuff, which is writing survey questions.
Right, we have a question. Okay, you talk about a lower risk with a smaller population, but if you've cherry picked your population, then you're only going to get feedback that you already know what it is. So
Sure.
then what's a lower risk?
So, okay, that is another side of the question. So yes, certainly if you were thinking about, say, a building renovation and you only approached, say, like recent donors to the Friends of the Library or something, you would be getting certainly a very cherry-picked view of the total situation. Smaller audiences can be really useful if you are looking at users of a particular service and their satisfaction rates. So for example, if you have a bookmobile and you're looking at satisfaction, then it would be useful to primarily target questions to present and past users of the bookmobile if your question is about satisfaction. Now, if you were thinking about broader trends, like maybe you are looking at census data and you see that you have a growing population of people who are candidates to use the bookmobile, then that might be a case where you would send a much larger survey. But you might still, if you were able to capture a population of survey recipients who were, for example, over the age of 50 or something like that, that would be still a way of looking at a smaller slice of your population. So I absolutely see your point. We should not cherry pick our populations. But if we are always surveying very large populations, we're missing opportunities to identify some more specific needs of our perhaps emerging populations of users or populations of users who have special needs. So that's, I'm reluctant to say you're wrong, because I absolutely agree that cherry picking populations is a poor choice, but there is still some value in thinking about a smaller population, especially if your questions are targeted to just particular needs or issues.
We have one question that came in on chat.
Sure.
You mentioned that students are heavily over-surveyed. Do you have any tips for trying to avoid that, especially if you don't have control over the surveys other departments on campus are running at the same time?
Yes, so we've certainly run into this issue. So when we do our biannual survey of students and employees here at our institution, we work with our registrar to get a sample of the student population. So rather than sending a survey invitation to every undergraduate who's enrolled, we get a sample. And so at our institution, we have about 10,000 students enrolled here. So we get a sample of 2,000. And we work with the registrar to make sure that the names that we are extracting randomly from the registrar's database are not people who have received the survey previously. Because since people are here for 4 or 5 or 6 years, there's a possibility that just a random data poll could produce the same names over and over again. So that helps us to avoid fatiguing users with the same questions. And it also helps us to not contribute to that bigger problem on our campus and all over of students getting way too many survey inquiries. And if we think about it, like students are surveyed after the end of every class. They receive a lot of different technology related surveys that administrators are required to send for various reasons. They probably receive various customer service surveys and things like that from different offices on campus. And then they may also be in classes where professors are requiring them to participate in surveys for assignment related reasons. So they have so many different opportunities. And we can't control them, but we can try to make our instruments as painless as possible and as efficient as possible. And then also be careful about how we create the list of recipients of the invitation to begin with.
It's pretty rare to get a heads up that something is competing with what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That did happen to us this spring. They are doing a large climate study on campus, and we have a much smaller library climate study that we are postponing until the fall just for that very reason. But it's very rare that you get a heads up that, another office on campus is planning.
Once I met someone from a university who is the person who gets to approve all surveys distributed on his campus. And that sounded kind of cool, but also kind of despotic, because then, if you want to do a survey, you might have to go through an office. So yeah, anyway, other questions?
We didn't have any more questions, but Erin did comment on the one from NCLS. He writes, I think of the smaller population audience in relation to library instruction. Asking about satisfaction with instruction sessions in a general survey told me nothing, except that 50% plus of our respondents had no library instruction. That spoke to a different issue.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I think the problem with satisfaction surveys related to instruction that we've grappled with our colleagues is that they just don't tell us much, except that maybe one librarian is much more popular or magnetic than another, or something like that, or maybe they tell us that students have participated in a whole bunch of the very same sessions over and over again, but they don't necessarily give us a good sense of what students are actually learning or applying. And those are the issues that we really care about if we're thinking about someone participating in a library training program or an educational or pedagogical practice. I agree.
If anyone else has any questions, feel free to chat it and we'll get it answered.
Yes.
So I think that intuitively, most people realize that survey questions, when you're developing questions, that they need to be clear and direct. But there's actually quite a bit more about developing questions than just the wordsmithing. For one thing, you want to choose the most effective or the best type of question for the information that you're trying to get at. So there are a lot of different question formats, from the familiar Likert scale to ranking questions, to some of the more complicated question matrices that you may have seen on surveys. And they lend themselves to specific question types and answer outputs. So when you begin developing your survey questions, you want to consider what formats to use and so that you can get the responses that are actually useful to you. So one thing that we found was really, really important as we were developing questions and testing them is that it's helpful to consider the results that your questions will generate. And there's a couple of different examples of questions that seem good, question formats that seem good on the face of it, but then provide you with really results that are hard to interpret. So for example, when you do like a multiple choice question where it's a choose all, it's very hard on the end of analyzing the responses to those questions to figure out, you don't get any sense of the user's priorities. You don't get a sense of whether they understood any constraints, or were they just selecting anything that seemed relevant. So one thing when you go through the developing your questions is thinking about what it's going to look like on the back end. And we did have a number of questions on the first round of our library survey that so many gradations. For example, if you have a Likert scale that's like a 7-point scale, you're not sure exactly how your users are interpreting the difference between mostly satisfied and very satisfied. That kind of like adding so much gray area while providing so many options can be a real problem. So when we think about survey questions, of course there's demographic questions, which are in their own category, and those can be very useful, particularly when combined with the results of other questions. But for the most part, when we ask questions on a survey, we are asking about 4 things. What do users do? What do users think? What do they want? And how they feel. And there are different question types that lend themselves to each of these areas. So in terms of asking your users what they do, and remember here again, we talked about self-reported data, you may be dealing with aspirational answers, what they think they should have done or what they aspire to doing, but it still could be a good question, particularly for those things that you can't measure. So for example, the question, how frequently do you use the library's website? We can tell based on traffic data, how often the website's used, what IPs use it, frequency, that kind of frequency, but we don't really know much about the habits of our individual users. And so you might want to know something like, if you have a user that's mainly interested in programming, are they checking once a week to find out what's available, what's on the schedule? Is it less than that? Are they using a different source altogether, like Facebook? And so a question about that is looking particularly there at frequency, the question of frequency might be useful. And so the formats for what people do tend to be yes or no, like, have you attended a library program in the last 6 months? Yes or no. Multiple choice, or the frequency or duration questions. When we think about how users think about, or what they often thinking is in the form of preferences, what they prefer, we usually look at formats such as ranking. Can be very helpful because, as I mentioned earlier, as opposed to asking like the question, how would you prefer to learn about future library programs, having them rank the options versus just selecting the ones that they most like lets you know a little bit more about their preferences. And we were really surprised when we first did our library survey and asked about communications preferences. We were pretty sure that everyone was really sick of receiving emails. Not that we send out a lot of emails, but we got a lot of emails here on campus. And yet that still actually turned out to be, for both students and faculty, the preferred way to receive library communications. So that was kind of interesting. Likert scales can also be particularly for satisfaction. And then open-ended questions is another way to get at what your users think. And as Robin already mentioned, open-ended questions are a little bit of they provide very rich data, but they can be difficult to interpret in the sense that it's very hard not to take the strongly worded responses more seriously, whether they're negative or positive, than you take other responses. And so it kind of requires that you do coding of your open-ended questions. For one thing, you want to know how many people actually wrote anything versus not wrote anything, because that tells you a little bit of something about what percentage of your population felt strongly enough to leave a comment. But another thing, it allows you to see how they aggregate. Like, is everybody commenting on how cold the library is, for example? But doing that kind of coding can take you from the situation where we had a library director who really liked to hone in on like one strongly worded comment and really chew on it for days and days, and he was so bothered by it. We had to remind him that there were other responses out there, but once we got everything coded, then that sort of diminished the power of that one strongly worded response.
We have a colleague who is always described as a genius by someone who responds to surveys about satisfaction about our library instruction program. And it's very likely to be the same person who's saying that over and over again. And it's wonderful for the colleague, and not to say that we aren't, all brilliant people, but it's not representative of the sum total of our instruction. That's an example.
So wants are usually what we're asking when we're planning on making purchases or making changes in our collecting or making changes in programming. And but the format is very similar to thinking in terms of ranking or multiple choice or open-ended questions. What subject areas would you like to see future programming cover, and having people rank them. And again, here's a place where you could use a combination of a closed-ended question like this with the option for an other response to get at any new ideas.
In thinking about the dangers of wants, everyone wants everything, right? Mm-hmm. So in our library, we have this terrible problem, which is that we used to have a coffee shop, and then the coffee shop was taken away for a variety of unclear reasons. And so now we really want the coffee shop back. But if we ask people in a survey to say yes or no to the question, would you like to see a coffee shop in the library? We probably will get a lot of emphatic yeses. but that doesn't necessarily tell us how people would prioritize the coffee shop over something else in the library.
The other issue, you want to be careful when you ask your users about wants, whether it's like, right now we're looking at some streaming video options, and we're asking for users to evaluate them in terms of, how they can help with their instruction. But we're trying to be careful not to promise too much. And asking about a want can also seem like a promise. For example, in a public library in this area about 2.5 years ago put out a survey asking about a building project, and they really wanted to know how people could rethink and reimagine their library. And they were asking questions about, like, do you want naturescapes? Do you want coffee shops? And to them, it was intended to be generating, like ideas or a sense of where the community was at with the public library. But it was also framed in terms of this future building project. And so it felt like there was sort of a promise there. And it was actually not until recently that anything came to fruition with that. So the other thing I would recommend is that when you are using your survey, to ask your users what's important to them, what they want in the future, that when you do deliver on that, like when you do make a decision, like we've decided to go with this ebook vendor because it provides more of the content that our users want, that you actually come out and say that. You say, thanks, even if it was like a year ago, thanks to the responses on our recent survey, we have decided to go ahead with this purchase or this, this new programming or, whatever it is. So always, and that's a way to really reinforce the goodwill, that your users are already exhibiting by filling out your survey. It just reinforces that you're actually using it. And so that's, the one thing about wants is that, and sometimes it can be really hard without getting really, really wordy in a survey to talk about options within the constraints that your budget might have or your building might have or whatnot. So how users feel is something that is not actually, this is what I was thinking. Feeling is actually fairly close to thinking, except we're talking more about the emotional state of users. And it's not something that's surveyed very often, but you can borrow from psychology uses when they're doing this in a non-sort of interview format. They use verbal scales to determine how people feel in different situations. And for libraries, we first started using this when we were trying to think about our interior of our library is really uninspired and dingy and I don't know, yes, not all that. So we want to know what effect that had on our users. It turns out it didn't have any effect, but so we were using verbal scales for that. But other ways that you might use verbal scales are in relation to things like safety or
feelings of belonging. So
yes.
So if you are interested in your library's climate for different user populations, for example.
So this is an option. It's not used as much as the other three people don't ask about it as much as they ask about the other three areas. So when you're looking at your wording, clear wording is paramount, but avoiding library jargon is actually really quite difficult, I think, because we're so steeped in it that sometimes we forget what words are jargon. And we actually had, when we were working on our first survey, a lot of discussion about whether reference and circulation were jargon, because they weren't words that we knew that our students use very much. Mm-hmm. And that they might not identify with them. And I think what we wound up doing was using photos in the survey to indicate the places so that if they didn't know what those words meant, they would at least know what we were referring to. The other thing you want to do, and this crops up every now and then, is that we have really complex things that we're trying to get at, and we wind up writing double-barreled questions. And what that really usually means is that you've got a really good set of questions that you're just grouping too closely together, and you need to break them apart. So an example is, should the library staff receive professional development in virtual reality and provide virtual reality tools in the collection? And, obviously that's like two separate questions that could be grouped together, paired together in the survey, but you don't want to confuse your reader because they won't really know which question that their answer is being interpreted as going with. And then the other thing, and the empathy part really helps with this, is focusing on providing a representative array of options so that you're really thinking of the things that matter to you, or the choices that your users are likely to make. And we had an experience the first time we did our survey where we thought we had done a pretty good job, and then we discovered that we weren't even thinking about transportation as, we're thinking of the way that we work at the library. We're thinking of our students as being mainly on campus. And so we had forgotten to ask any questions regarding transportation, getting to the library, and whether that was a barrier. And so that was an empathy issue that we were able to correct later, but it was a flaw of our not really thinking through our whole user population. There's a lot of research into the neutral option, which is when you're thinking of a Likert scale or a set of multiple choices where you get an out, like basically an out, like are you satisfied, unsatisfied, or neither satisfied or unsatisfied. What they found is that a lot of users, even if they do have an actual opinion, even a strong opinion, will zone in on the neutral option, either because they're trying not to offend the library, or it's just easier than making that decision. So in poker, there's a phrase about putting your user to the test. Like you want to put them on a decision, make them make a decision. And so, for example, the question, how do you feel about your safety when visiting the library? Well, as I'm reading that, I might think, I feel pretty safe. But then, as I see the option, neither safe or unsafe, I might just simply select that. And the point here is that it limits the amount of data you actually get from your survey if like 30% of the people are satisficing with that neutral option. Usually they recommend doing 4-point or 6-point Likert scales rather than 5-point or 3-point, so that you get away from that, the neutral.
And something to say about that is rather than including a neutral option, you can often choose an option like this is not applicable to me, or I have never used this service, or I have no opinion, or something like that. So giving people the ability to say that they don't have an opinion because they haven't actually done it is a totally reasonable choice. And that actually gives you some valuable data about awareness and accessing services and things like that. But that's different than simply saying my feelings about this are neutral.
I think as librarians, we gravitate towards organization. And so it's not surprising that you would want to group your questions by topic or area of the library, or whatever it might be. But one thing about arranging your survey questions that I don't know that this was intuitive for us was the idea of starting easy, giving your user the opportunity to express their opinion in a way that isn't very challenging for them, so that they get a foothold in the survey and they feel more committed to finishing it. So generally, starting easy and having more difficult questions later in the survey is a good idea. And as we've already sort of advocated for limiting open-ended questions, not only because of the work that you have to do to analyze, but it's also a lot of work for users. And the more that you have of open-ended questions, the more likely your responses to each are going to be briefer and briefer. Question about where to put your demographic questions isn't a settled thing at all. There's a lot of disagreement about this. But I will say that one of the arguments that might be compelling about putting your demographic questions at the end is that it gets your users talking about they're answering your survey because they hopefully care about your library. So it gets them involved in your survey doing what they want to do early on, rather than answering piddling demographic questions. So you get your question, you've written your questions, you've sort of arranged them, and now is a really good time to do testing and revision. And we have really avoided embarrassing experiences of sending out surveys with questions that actually either weren't very understandable, or would result in a set of responses that were kind of meaningless. So it's really worth it from that point of view. And so we highly recommend that you test and revise. And when you're testing, you want to test with both internal and external users. We talked earlier about who should make up sort of group of people who design the survey, or even if it's an individual. Ideally, your internal testers will not be amongst that group, but they will be people who for one, have a sense, a good sense of the library itself, but also you want to make sure that they understand the purpose of the survey, because we don't always, we often have surveys that have a more limited focus, and it's important that they understand what your objectives are in doing the survey, because oftentimes our colleagues have ideas or will generate ideas as they read the survey of other things that they'd like to know, and you don't want your survey to bloat into a large, adding questions that don't really go with the purpose of the survey. So, but internal testers are really good at figuring out things like information that's missing, options that you've forgotten about. Editing, yes. But when you reach out to your external testers, and it doesn't have to be a lot of them, sometimes just 2 or 3 patrons, maybe people who are on the, Friends of the Library or whatnot. But the thing that they're very good at is ferreting out the jargon, pointing out questions that don't make sense from a non-librarian perspective, and then also adding in choices, things that you might have not realized were, viable choices for your patrons or for your users. After you've gotten their responses back and you've edited your survey, it's a good idea to look at the big picture with the survey. You may have moved things around, you may have deleted questions. Does the survey flow still make sense? You want to time it at that point. Do you need more? You don't need more, but do you need, is it going to be too taxing? Are there things that you can cut? You really want to look at every question and say, is this fulfilling the purpose that we designed it for? Does this question bring joy? Can I cut it if your survey is going to be, as we said, you don't want to fatigue your users. And the longer your survey is, the poorer the responses at the end of the survey tend to be.
So next Thursday, we'll meet again, and we will talk about strategies for distributing surveys. SurveyMonkey and web-based platforms are certainly an option, but there are considerations for other types of survey distribution depending on your population and, of course, your purpose. And then we will also talk about analysis of results, which is the best part. And part of analysis is also thinking about how we'll take action. So we welcome your questions, and also say that between now and next Thursday, you can also send us survey questions that we would be happy to look over. And Christy can give you our contact information, or you can send them to her and she can forward them on to us. But we are happy to look at any survey question ideas that you have come up with and can serve in a way as informal testers for you too.
We do have one from Alice. Is it better to ask someone to check all that apply or to rate?
Great question. Check all that apply sounds like a really good idea, but it doesn't give us a good sense of the priorities. So if you were doing a collection survey and you wanted people to identify their favorite genres, someone very well could say, well, I like everything, and check all that apply, but that person's actual patron profile might be that they really only like LGBTQ romances. And that's a pretty narrow thing. But the ranking option is going to give you more definitive data.
The one exception, or I think an exception to that, though, is when you're asking users about obstacles.
Oh, yes.
Because very often the ranking is less important, or the priorities, and it's more important for you to know, for example, what is preventing them from coming into the library or coming to programming. And if it's both transportation and childcare, you want both of those pieces of information.
Right.
And they may not, and it may be also counterintuitive for them to rank, which one is more important. Yeah. So there is a place for the check all that apply, but it's, when you're looking at wants, then I think you want to do the ranking.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
How much do demographic questions matter? We worry about asking for too much personal info.
Oh, that's a really good question. You don't want to ask for any info that you're not going to use.
Right.
And that can be difficult because sometimes it's hard to anticipate what will be important. But we try not to ask about anything that won't be a factor, because the nice thing about the current, for example, online survey tools is that you can do all that kind of cross tabulation or cross-referencing, so you can break down the responses to your questions by demographic group, but there's some demographic groups that aren't really relevant to learning more about a question. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So in the back of our book, we have an appendix that's specifically about demographics. And I think that these options really depend on your community and also your purpose. So to give you an example from our community, we know that while the community we live in is largely white, that the fastest growing population of people under the age of 25 are people of color, and particularly people in whose households Spanish is spoken. So if our school district library media center, or if our public library, or even our university wanted to learn more about the literature needs, literacy needs, the information literacy needs, things like that, of that population, some questions specifically about language spoken at home and age of people residing in the home would be really helpful. But that wouldn't mean that we would also need to ask questions like, what's your citizenship status, or what is your what are the nationalities that your family is from, and things like that. Like that's not going to get us to the question of or an answer like, oh, we should really beef up our Spanish language young adult literature, or something like that. So that's an example from our own community. I'll also say that sometimes it's possible to extract demographic data from systems that you already have. So community colleges and universities have a big advantage here, but so do special libraries that might have be attached to a large human resources unit. Because they could probably mine contact information for individuals who fit a certain profile. So for example, if we wanted to only survey students who were second or third years at our institution, we would be able to work with our registrar. Or if we only wanted to survey people who are assistant professors or adjunct lecturers or something like that, we could work with our human resources department and registrar to figure that out. So sometimes you can skip the demographics by just capturing the small population that you're interested in, and that also saves them time.
I would also say that that's an area where you can really alienate your users by asking too much demographic information.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
Again, tying it to like, are you going to actually sort of slice your responses based on
mm-hmm.
that demographic data? And if you're not, then don't ask it.
Right. Yeah. But especially in libraries where we're very concerned about privacy, if we ask for personally identifying information, we also need to make a plan for how we're going to protect that information, so it's not so it doesn't get in the wrong hands.
Thank you so much again, and I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Super. Well, we look forward to talking with you again next week.